Welcome to Grace Gospel Fellowship, Bensonville, Sunday morning Bible study. We'll try and have to edit that out, but live video, at least I hope it's working now. I was talking about the painting you see behind you. It's an original by Joe de Velasco. It's based on, when I talked to Corinne, Joe's widow, she told me she didn't really know what the inspiration for this painting was originally. And one day she was flipping through his Bible, which, if you know Joe, he had illustrated his Bible, and she was flipping through Ezekiel, and she landed on chapter 17, and she read, I think it's verse 3, about this multicolored eagle. And Joe had drawn it originally in his Bible, and then did this original painting. And it's significant because God uses it as a riddle for Ezekiel to tell the people of Israel as a warning. The judgment is coming. This particular judgment, the first eagle in Ezekiel, is Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, who's coming, and he's going to swoop down and steal the twigs at the top of the tree, which would be Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It's a warning to Israel to get their act together. So I guess I need to get my act together. But this morning I wanted to talk to you about a few things in the news. I'm going to do this more or less like I do on Thursdays, which is an appeal to evangelism and apologetics and a faithful understanding of the gospel and how to deliver the gospel. Before I begin, and really the inspiration for this morning is waking up and finding out that a group of Muslim terrorists had bombed a cathedral in the Philippines, killing 20 of our brothers and sisters this morning. At least the morning in the Philippines. And so I thought I would take a morning to talk about Islam and the gospel and how we deliver an apologetic in a world like this. And we're told by the writer of Hebrews that we're to remember all those who are suffering around the globe. And we're seeing Christians put in jail in China. We're seeing them burned alive in Nigeria and Mosul. And of course now the victims of a bombing in the Philippines. So I want to talk to you a little bit about that and share with you what I think are do's and don'ts. And then if you stay with me to the end of this episode, and I'm going to try and make it about a half hour, you will see what I believe is the greatest apologetic, and the greatest 5-minute apologetic in the last 10 years, delivered by one of the world's leading mathematicians in a very hostile setting, which was Harvard University. And I think it was a masterful lesson that we could all learn from. And I hope you stay with me as we analyze that and glean from it wisdom to use in our own testimony and our own witness. But before I begin, let's open in a short word of prayer. I know it might seem a little bit awkward, but if you're watching with heads bowed and eyes closed. Blessed are you, O Lord. Blessed are you, O Lord, our God, Lord of the storm, who gives us this wonderful day and the opportunity through technology to study your word and worship in your name. We ask your blessing on today's message and on all those who are listening. May we go forward this week in word, in thought, and deed to your glory and in your spirit. On behalf of the precious name of Jesus Christ, we ask this. Amen. Thank you. All right. So where to begin? I wanted to talk to you a bit about Islam and what I want to say involving that might be a little bit offensive at first, because I know there are people who get really worked up about this, right? And so what I wanted to tell you is I think there's a wrong perspective that people are approaching Islam with. As a matter of fact, there are I've been invited and declined on a number of occasions. There are Illinois family groups or churches in the area that have these conferences on Islam. and they really are based on fear. They're going to talk to you about how horrible Islam is and why we should be wary of it and so forth. And I really don't think that's a fruitful approach. I think people obviously know that there's something out of joint there with the majority of terrorism in the world coming from the Islamic world. So to focus on that, I don't think is helpful. If one of these family groups or churches decides to do a conference on how to witness to our Muslim neighbor, now we're onto something. All right, now I understand the Christian fruitfulness behind it. But let me just share a couple of ideas. And I think there's two main approaches you approach with your Muslim neighbor, friend at work, coworker, or what have you, or if you get involved in these conversations. And there are two that rarely come up in the discussion because of this, what I would call collateral distraction. And when you hear Christians talk about Islam, they are always, developing their phobia toward it. And a lot of it comes across with facts. They have facts and it's truthful. But I think it's taking us down a rabbit hole we don't want to go. I think it's a distraction. Let me give you a couple examples. If your conversation about Islam focuses on the doctrine of taqiyya or abrogation, or even the person of Muhammad and his sins, I think you are failing in your argument and in your presentation of the gospel. And I'll give you a couple of practical reasons why, and then I'll offer you a solution, what I think is the best solution. We could take them one by one. If you don't know what taqiyya is, people who know a lot about Islam do, and they usually share it, and they share it in a way that to an Islamic listener would be very offensive. Taqiyya is kind of a doctrine that says if you're a Muslim, you could lie to a non-Muslim as if it's to further the faith. And that's a doctrine. And, if you talk to 100 Muslims, maybe 13 of them have ever even heard of it. You know who's heard of it? The guys who do these scare conferences about Islam. And that's a big drumbeat in these scare conferences. And so they'll say, don't you know that the Muslim can lie to the non-Muslim to further their message? And usually when I'm in a conversation I like this, I say, do you mean like the Hebrew midwives did in the Old Testament? Or like Rahab did in the Old Testament? Do you mean like that? All of these things can be turned back on the Old Testament and places that aren't fruitful for us to occupy. Andy Stanley was right about that. Andy Stanley was talking about Christian witness and bringing people to the cross and the gospel. And you don't really get there through Leviticus. That is something that comes under sanctification, the whole counsel of God. I get it. But that shouldn't be part of your witness and your testimony because it's going to be a distraction. And how? Well, let's pick abrogation. You know what abrogation is? Abrogation is this understanding that the Quran, if you read the Quran, you'll find that it's organized in a strange way. It's not really organized chronologically. It's organized by the longest chapters to the shortest chapters. And so there's a mixed bag in the Quran if you read it. There are some passages that do sound very peaceful and that argue for peace among mankind and all that. And then there are the brutal passages that you hear about if you go to these conferences or if you read a scare book on Islam, and they're pretty brutal. And abrogation is a doctrine in Islam that says the later writings abrogate the previous writings. And so if you get in this argument with people and they bring up Christianity, the truth is we have that in Christianity. Whether you call it the New Covenant or the dispensations, we're not living under the Levitical law. We're not stoning people who carry a cup of milk across the kitchen on the Sabbath. So that's another danger. The idea of abrogation as being something that is weird in Islam and it doesn't happen in other religions. It does. It happened even in Judaism. In the Old Testament, I could show you places in that. Now, here's where it's a little bit weird with Islam. It's the violent passages came later. right? So the violent passages in the Hadith and the Quran came later. So, but I still think that it would be wrong to make that a point of division. Your main point about why Islam is wrong. I think that's a distraction. Third one, Muhammad. People love to compare Muhammad to Jesus. And especially they like to bring up that Muhammad had a 9-year-old wife. I think these are both mistakes, especially if you're witnessing to a Muslim. You're going to offend the person greatly. But first of all, let's look at it logically for a second, okay? Islam says Muhammad is not the son of Allah. Islam doesn't claim that Muhammad is deity. Islam claims that Muhammad was a prophet, right? Christianity claims Christ is deity, son of the Most High God. Why is it fair to compare Jesus to Muhammad if we're talking religions? Shouldn't we compare the prophet of Islam to prophets in Christianity? Now, when we do, things even out. Because yes, Muhammad conquered by the sword. So did Moses. If you go back in the Old Testament, you find out that Moses conquered 60 fortified cities in the cleansing of Canaan. You know what happened to the prophets of Baal? I mean, the prophet wasn't handing out gospel tracts. So again, it's going to take us back to the Old Testament. It's going to take us back to having to defend the genocide in Canaan, or whatever the left is going to refer to it, or the non-Christian. And we never get to the cross of Jesus Christ. So these things, the fact that Muhammad took multiple wives, like David, like Solomon, the fact that Muhammad took young wives. Well, you read any Bible dictionary, you're going to find out that Mary was probably between 12 and 14, because the culture of the first century was fine with that. Now, 9-year-old, yeah, but I don't think it's a really good approach to a Muslim that you're witnessing to basically call their prophet a pedophile. I don't think you need to. They'll come to that understanding later. But if you open with that, you're going to lose an opportunity, right? So here's the two main things that set apart Christianity from Islam, all right? And these are things that I think the only things that Christians should focus on when they're talking about this in a testimony kind of setting. And this is what I wish all these conferences would focus on, not how awful Islam is. That's kind of obvious, the consequences of the jihadi. But how do we witness to people who are caught up in this bondage? How do we run an underground railroad to get men and women who are our brothers in mankind? Paul says to the Athenians that we're all God's offspring. How do we get these image bearers of God to recognize that they're blind and to drop the blinders and see the truth? Well, you don't do it by walking through their garden and upheaving it. You show them our garden that bears fruit, where the trees bear fruit, that's fruitful, that's beautiful, that's good. And here's the main difference between Christianity and Islam. Now, I'm not talking about the Christian religion. I'm talking about authentic Christianity. And the main difference is this: our argument should be Jesus Christ. It is Jesus Christ that sets Christianity apart from everything else. You don't really want to argue ethics or morals. Romans 1 kind of suggests that every man has an understanding of the moral law within. God gives it to every man. God gives man, natural man born of a woman, man born from anywhere around the world, without ever hearing a Christian witness, a missionary, or opening a Bible. Every man and woman born of woman has the witness of creation all around him to show the power of God and the witness of God, and also the moral conscience within. I shared this one day recently, and a pastor wrote underneath my commentary on Romans 1. I guess he didn't think I was commenting on Romans 1, but he wrote, well, this isn't true for Muslims. And I practically fell out of my seat at the bigotry, because he wasn't arguing with John Kirkwood. He was arguing with God, with Solomon in Ecclesiastes, who said that God has put the spark of eternal life on every human heart. He was arguing with the Apostle Paul, who says every human has the moral law within, this idea of conscience. And so I think we get into really bad areas when we can't make a distinction between Islam, which is a false religion, and a Muslim, who is somebody who is in bondage, who's been blinded by the God of this world and a system right out of the pit of hell, but is a victim of that. And when we don't look at them like that, it's hard to love them, and it's hard to share the gospel with them. So if you're sharing the gospel with a Muslim, take a page out of right before Nabil Qureshi died. Nabil and David Wood made a series of videos about how to witness to a Muslim. And David Wood said in those videos, so did Nabil, look, he said some harsh things to Nabil about the Prophet and about Islam and the violence and its history. But he didn't open with that. They became friends, and they became good friends, and he knew he'd be able to say these things without losing the friendship or losing the opportunity to witness. They had come to a common ground where they could say things to each other and not be offended and be able to weigh what the other person was saying. So I think we do need to be, yes, as smart as serpents, but we certainly need to be as pure as doves in our approach to this. And the truth is that it's Jesus Christ that sets Christianity apart. Now, I do want to introduce you to a couple things. You are about to see what I argued was probably the greatest apologetic I've seen in a public setting in the last 10 years. It happened 6 years ago at Harvard. And I'm about to show it to you, and I'll set it up. But before I do, I want to give you a couple of points that I shared online this week. And I want to start with a lesson I actually learned from, John Paul II. Now, let me share it with you and see if you can see the picture. Yes, this is from 35 years ago. Actually, it's more than that. It was, 35 years ago on December 27th. And this was shared, by the way, in FEE, at fee.org, under an article entitled The Transformative Power of Forgiveness. I'll try and put the link in the comments today. But 35 years ago, on December 27th, the world witnessed the most extraordinary act of forgiveness. In Rome's Rebibbia prison, Pope John Paul II met for the first time with Mehmet Ali Aja, the very terrorist who shot him 4 times in St. Peter's Square just 2.5 years earlier. The two men sat inches from each other for 21 minutes in Aja's cell, engrossed in conversation, eyeball to eyeball as they clasped hands, and John Paul uttered firmly, "I forgive you." Of course, the story gets better because when Aja was released, he ends up going to Rome, visiting the grave and laying flowers on the grave. He was converted by this extreme act of forgiveness by John Paul. It's a wonderful story of forgiveness. But it brings us to a couple of elements that I think are actually quite thought-provoking and worthy of interest. One of them I share to you out of a book called Common Prayer. And in this book, we get this comment about peacemaking, and peacemaking, it says, doesn't mean passivity. It is the act of interrupting injustice without mirroring injustice, the act of disarming evil without destroying the evildoer, the act of finding a third way that is neither fight nor flight, but the careful, arduous pursuit of reconciliation and justice. It is about a revolution of love that is big enough to set both the oppressed and the oppressors free. That from Common Prayer, A Liturgy for Ordinary Radicals. That's by Shane Claiborne. And so I think you have here something that was, that's actually rather good doctrine that was practiced not only by John Paul II, but by the Elliott family, Elizabeth Elliott, and her witness and missional movement when she goes back to the very people who had killed her husband, Jim Elliott, and others, and leads them to the Lord. So a couple of points, and then to the greatest apologetic I've seen in 6 years. If our apologetic, right, if our apologetic is about winning and not witness, then we will wield truth like a baseball bat, and the gospel is shared like blunt force trauma. And we've all been a witness to this. Hopefully, we haven't been either the recipient or the perpetrator, but we've all witnessed it. We've all seen bullies use Christianity, use the two-edged sword to kill and to maim, and that's not what we're called to do. Peter brings up this idea. Maybe I can share that. Let me share what Peter says about our witness, and then we will come back. Let me see here. In 1 Peter 3, he's given his comments here, and he says, finally, all of you be harmonious, sympathetic. This is verse 8, if you're reading along. I'm reading from the Tree of Life version. Finally, all of you be harmonious, opposite of a cacophony, sympathetic, brotherly, tender-hearted, humble-minded. Now, is Peter just saying this, that we should be this way to our Christian neighbor or Christian brothers and sisters? No. Christ argued, even the wicked love their own. That's not supernatural. That's not agape. So he's arguing that this should be our demeanor, our tone toward all people. Finally, all of you be harmonious, sympathetic, brotherly, tenderhearted, humble-minded. Do not repay evil for evil or insult for insult, but give a blessing instead. It is for this reason you were called, so that you might inherit a blessing. Stop here for a moment. I see Christians all the time quoting the imprecatory Psalms about punching the enemy in the teeth, crushing his teeth. A gentleman the other day just said, yeah, we have to confront the flint head of the enemies and so forth. And they quote the Old Testament, which was, by the way, if I can use a word that I used about talking about Muslims, abrogated. We are not to pray for the destruction of our enemies through violence. We are to pray for the destruction of our enemies through the gospel, that the gospel softens their heart, not crushes their teeth. And we have not been called to be Elijah or Elisha. We have not been called to slay the false prophets on Mount Carmel. We've been called to follow Paul as he follows Christ. So I agree with Andy Stanley on that. Do not repay evil for evil or insult for insult, but give a blessing instead. It is for this reason you were called, so that you might inherit a blessing. For the one who loves life, wanting to see good days, must keep his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. He must turn away from evil and do good. He must seek shalom and pursue it. See, if you give the truth and your truth isn't robed in love, you're sinning. You're not sinning by telling a falsehood. You're sinning by the delivery of the truth. 1 Corinthians 13, you might want to check that passage out too, but here we go. For the eyes of Adonai are on the righteous, and his ears open to their prayer. But the face of Adonai is against those who do evil. Who is going to harm you if you are eager to do good? But even if you should suffer for what is right, and Christians do suffer for what is right, you are blessed. Do not be afraid or worry about their threats. Instead, sanctify Messiah as Lord in your hearts. Always be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you. Hold here for 1 second. Always be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Now, Peter doesn't say here that you have to have an answer for everything. Some of the greatest answers a Christian could give are simply, I don't know. If you don't know, don't try and answer it, because then you create and raise suspicion in the hearer. No one likes a know-it-all, number one, but no one believes a know-it-all, number two. And if you don't know it all, which breaking news, none of us do, then you aren't going to be bearing the truth all the time. And you get caught up in allowing other men to think for you, and those other men might not be getting an A on the test. You might be copying off somebody who's getting a D-. You never know. One of the most humble things a Christian could say is, I don't know. This text does not require you to have an answer for everything. This text only requires you to have an answer for the hope that is within you, right? And hopefully every Christian has that answer. That's the name of a person, Jesus Christ. Now, when Pandora's box was flung open, a Greek understanding or a mythological understanding of why there's sin in the world, all the nasties flew out. But if you remember your 8th grade class on Greek mythology, there was one thing left in the box when all this depravity entered into the world. And that one thing was hope. This is what Peter's calling us to do. But how do you deliver that hope? Like a Louisville Slugger over the head? No, Peter goes on and he says, be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet with humility and reverence, kindness, keeping a clear conscience, so that whatever you're accused of, those who abuse you for your good conduct in a Messiah may be put to shame. It'll be shameful to them that they're even accusing you of something, because it'll be so obvious to your fellow men that it's slander. All right, so let me set up what I think is a wonderful example, ladies and gentlemen, of a great apologetic. And we might, let me give you one more quote of mine, and then we'll set up Harvard Veritas Forum from 6 years ago. When we choose to win an argument where we may have touched a soul, we've lost an opportunity. When we choose to win an argument where we may have touched a soul, we've lost an opportunity. And that is an opportunity, folks, that we could glorify God. And so I think we have to be very careful in the way we deliver the gospel. Now, why did it disappear? I might have to go back. Give me a second while I find it, but I'll set it up while I'm looking for it. What you are about to watch is one of the world's leading mathematicians, John Lennox, addressing a group of young university students at Harvard in a Veritas Forum from 6 years ago. And John Lennox is, as soon as I can find it,
science.
Yes. All right. And John Lennox is going to do something here that's magical, absolutely magical. And what do I mean by that? The first thing he does is he is able to disarm the audience. And so when you're going into an audience setting, and some of us will never speak in front of Harvard. Some of us may never speak in front of a room. We might speak in front of 2 or 3 people at the lunch table at work, or while we're fishing with the guys over a weekend. We will be put in situations like this, but we might not be put in a situation like this that is being televised and at Harvard and in such a hostile setting. What I mean by hostile is he's not among a group of people who don't believe in mathematics. But he is among a group of people that we know from polling do not believe, they have a post-Christian worldview. They don't believe that Christianity is true. They believe science has disproved it. And what else do they believe? They believe what they've read in the New Atheists. In other words, that Christianity or that religion is the cause of all wars. So that is the cause of violence. They also believe that all religions are alike. They've heard this from Christopher Hitchens, from Bill Maher, if they've read Richard Dawkins. So this is his understanding of the crowd he's talking to. Now, I want to share this with you, and I'm hoping you have some background with Christians speaking in front of crowds like this, because most of the time you get a Christian in front of a crowd like this, you don't get any clapping. You might even get booing. You might even get interruptions, but you certainly don't get the ovation that he gets at the end of this commentary. And it's not because he compromised on the gospel. He doesn't, and you'll see it. But let me tell you about his technique and his delivery and why it's majestic. Ravi Zacharias does this sometimes too as well, folks, and we should study the men who do it well. I'm not picking on Frank Turek here. Frank Turek has a different type of ministry, but Frank Turek goes into situations like this and it becomes very hostile, and he rarely gets a response like this. And that's because his apologetic is different. We could talk about that another day. But Solzhenitsyn spoke in front of a group of Harvard students in the 70s and was booed. Now, he told truth, but his delivery of that truth came across like a Louisville Slugger. And so it's not surprising the reaction he got. And we could go back and look at his speech and marvel at the truth he told, but it was in his delivery and technique that it wasn't received. Because as Ravi says, you don't cut off somebody's nose and then offer them a rose and expect them to smile, right? So what does he do? First, he knows his audience, and he knows that they're post-Christian millennials, right? Young people who don't necessarily believe in God. And what they do believe about a religion is that religion is violent, that all religions are alike, and so that the Christianity is no different than Judaism and Islam and so forth. He knows his audience, and going in before he offers the gospel, he's going to disarm all those. He's going to diffuse like a bomb expert in Iraq who finds a roadside IED. And they go and they diffuse it before it can go off. So he's going to carefully approach these roadside bombs of Christianity leads to violence, of Christianity is opposed to science, of all religions are alike. He's going to diffuse all these bombs. He's going to get the crowd agreeing with him. And then he's going to present the difference of Christianity. Now, if he would have started with the exclusive nature of Christianity, they would have tuned out. If he would have said, this is why Christianity is better than all those crazy false religions, they would not have listened. But he delivers a sterling gospel because he shows exactly what Peter called us to do it humbly and with respect to our audience. He loves these people in the crowd. He loves them. And so he's careful as how he approaches them. But I want you, and you need to watch this over and over and over again. I'll put the link in the comments, but watch it and see how every word and every sentence is chosen right. Now, finally, when he does get to the gospel, notice how it's different than much of the gospel that we hear out of Christianity today. He delivers a gospel that is all about Christ and salvation. So there's no false gospels here. There's no watered down gospel. There's no understanding of you should accept Jesus because he could fix your marriage, or you'll be more prosperous, or it's a better ethical system. He agrees that all religions have something in common, which is stupid to fight against because Romans 1 tells us that. But anyway, but the important thing is he builds on humility. And how does he show humility? He gives up rope where we could give up rope. Now, here's a mistake that many young apologists make. Somebody will argue that Christianity has led to violence, and they'll deny it, and they'll argue against it. And they do so because they're defending Christianity. And they'll say, well, you don't understand the Crusades, or they'll say, well, the Inquisition wasn't real Christians. And it gets to be such a phony thing, like a reflexive, defensive thing. We know that people have done heinous things in the name of Christ. We don't do Christ any favors by trying to defend heinous activity in the name of Christ. We don't. And so John Lennox is willing to give room on that. He even brings up his hometown, where he's from, Northern Ireland, where we know horrible things were done in the name of Christ. So he's willing to give up certain totems that some Christians want to defend when he realizes that a true defense of the faith is centered around the person and the work of Jesus Christ, right there, 3 feet around the cross. So without further ado, I'm going to share this magnificent gospel from our brother John Lennox.
Science and religion, but they're different religions. Now, this is an immensely important question, because leaving Christianity outside altogether, religions do not agree with each other. It's idle to pretend that they do. Science is an international discipline. And of course, we are all aware of the sad fightings, even within Christendom, in my own country of Northern Ireland. So I've got a lot to answer for in a way. And how do I approach this question? Well, in exactly the same way as everything else. I find, let's take the 3 great monotheistic religions. I have many Muslim friends and Jewish friends. The Jews believe, my Jewish friends believe that Jesus died and did not rise. My Muslim friends believe he didn't die. And I believe that he both died and rose. They cannot all be true. How do you approach a question like that? Well, first of all, I step completely back from it. And I realize that there are 2 levels of difference between religions. And the first thing to recognize, ladies and gentlemen, as you go around the world, study all religions or none, people of any faith, philosophy you care to name, you'll find a striking fact. And it's that there's a common element of morality that's shared by almost every living human being. I've done a bit of research on this. And you will find the golden rule, do unto others as you would be done by, in every single religion, in every single philosophy, even Roman pagan philosophy, and in the fundamental statement of British humanism. You will find it everywhere. What does that tell me? It tells me that we need to respect each other's ethical code. Sometimes as a Christian, I can be put to shame by the moral integrity of another religion. And therefore we approach this with great sensitivity. So that's the first thing. But what I notice is this, ladies and gentlemen, that the real difference comes not at the level of ethics and morality, so much as at the level of the basis on which a person can have a relationship with God. And there, religions and philosophies divide into 2 systems. One of the systems is a bit like Harvard University. There is an entrance examination. I presume you have an entrance, do you? Or do you just get in without an exam? No. So there's an entrance exam, so we can imagine that as the door. And then there's the Harvard way, and it goes up and down. And you try and stay on it, as are all the professors to teach you. And then there's a whacking great gate at the end. It's called final exam. Now, the whole principle on which the system depends is that of merit. The professors, all of them are infinitely kind. And, but I hope they are anyway. But they cannot guarantee that you're going to get through the door at the end. It depends on merit, your performance, your achievement. And many religions are like that, and their adherents tell me they're like that. There's some initiation rite, you get on the way, you try to follow the way, and you hope that then when the great assessment comes, and your good deeds are measured against your bad deeds, that somehow the good ones will weigh more than the bad ones, and you will be accepted into whatever is beyond. I know that's a slight caricature, but it's what many people believe. It's what many Christians actually believe. I do not believe that at all. Because, ladies and gentlemen, the unique thing, it seems to me, about Christian faith is it's not based on merit. because it does have a gate in a way. But at the beginning, there stands Jesus Christ, who claims to have come into the world to die for my sin. Now, that's a very ugly word to raise in Harvard, but you did ask me about religions, so I'll have to give you the answer that I believe is the truth. In other words, let me put it this way. Suppose I did my first day at Cambridge, I saw a beautiful girl. I married her eventually. I suppose I went to her and said, Sally, you know, I'd like to marry you, but here's a cookbook. Now, it's got a whole lot of rules inside it. Now, if you keep those rules fairly well for the next 30 or 40 years, I will think about accepting you. Of course, I couldn't possibly accept you now. But if you perform well enough, when the final assessment comes, I will accept you. Well, some of you are laughing. Others of you might be experiencing that, I don't know. But you see, that would be to insult her. The secret of my marriage, ladies and gentlemen, is this: that we accepted each other at the beginning, unconditionally. And because she doesn't have to keep the rules of the cookbook, so to speak, in order to gain my acceptance, that sets her free to learn it. And it's exactly the same with God. We wouldn't dream of basing our relationship with a fellow human being on a measured performance and an acceptance at the end of a long history of performing laws. And yet millions of people think that that's a way to base a relationship with God. And it seems to me here, and let me say it straight, Christianity competes with no other religion here. Because as far as I could see, Christ is the only person that offers me the knowledge of forgiveness right here and now. So in my life, I try to live for him, not in order to gain his acceptance, but because, ladies and gentlemen, I already have it. It's not based on my performance or my merit. It's based on the merit of Jesus Christ, who died and rose for me. And there, ladies and gentlemen, I think we'll have to leave it. Thank you for your patience.
For more information about
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that really is how it's done. Now, I want to point out a few things. I already commented on a lot of what he did to unpack and present the gospel, but I want to say two things. Notice how he closed. The strength of his close was a perfect gospel, and it actually was even an undoing of some Christian gospels. His argument against merit is addressing down of what's called lordship salvation, or even Catholic doctrines. And so here he is, he's setting apart the pristine nature of the gospel. But if he would have opened that question with no other religion has it on Jesus Christ, or Christ, here's where Christ is different than every other world religion, Christianity is different than every other world religion, he wouldn't have had the attention that he did of the audience building to that moment. So that's something we can learn from. The second thing I want to point out to you is if you watch this again, I encourage you to do it. You'll notice that he doesn't answer the question he was given. He doesn't answer the question he was given. This was the last question they were taking, and John Lennox is going to get the gospel in. Heaven or come high water, you might say. He's going to get the gospel in. If you go back and listen, you'll find out the question was actually about how does he reconcile faith and science? That's a different question, right? And he doesn't dismiss science. He nods to science and he goes right to faith. And he begins on how religions are the same, that they're right. Religions are all the same when it comes to sin, violence, and also a basic morality, the golden rule. And he brings up the three world religions on something that maybe people didn't know, which is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And he says, here's how they can't be the same, because my Muslim friends, deny that Christ ever died. My Jewish friends deny that he ever rose. And of course, I believe that Christ both died and rose. Now, so he builds, that's a mathematical equation there. That's something that, A plus B equals C is not the same with Muslims and Jews there. So that is a distinction. He's starting to draw a distinction there. What else does he do that we can glean from this? He uses humor and he uses analogies. The analogy of going up to a pretty girl on the first day you meet her at college and offering her a cookbook and say, follow this for 40 years and maybe I'll marry you. That is how a relationship with God is presented in most world religions, including a large corner of Christianity. And so he's able to talk to them about something they know about, graduating from Harvard, and how it takes merit, and how you might get into Harvard differently, but no one gets out of Harvard differently. You might get there easier than some other people, but you've got to live up to their reputation to get out of there. And so he draws a distinction between how most of the world's religions are based on merit. Christianity is based on merit too, but not yours or mine, on Christ's merit. And so I think that's something we can watch over and over and glean from. He has a crowd now that I think has heard a version of Christianity that was foreign to them. That's not the Christianity that they've read about in Christopher Hitchens. It's not the Christianity that they've heard about on Bill Maher. And this old guy who seems like a really smart grandfather presented something different and maybe placed a stone in my shoe. The other thing is he's got their respect because he's a scientist, right? And there is this impression that faith and science are at war, and they really can't, they really don't go together. And his very being and his very reason for being invited for Harvard and so forth dismisses that idea. And so I'm grateful for men like John Polkinghorne and John Lennox and Francis Collins. These are devout Christians who are at the top of their fields in science, whether it was particle physics or biology, or in John Lennox's case, mathematics. So we shouldn't shun science, and we shouldn't put scientists to the back of the bus. In a large sense, it is through the path of science that we have an opening with the post-Christian world, and through literature, through C.S. Lewis and men like him. So keep that in mind. I hope you've enjoyed today. I'm grateful that you joined me today. Share this if you like it. The first few minutes had the volume off. We'll trim that down on YouTube and resubmit it. Hopefully we'll see you all next Sunday live in Bensonville, where we could greet each other and provoke one another to greater acts of love. Thank you for joining me with a short word of prayer. Heavenly Father, I'm grateful for technology. I'm grateful for the opportunity to fellowship with men and women, brothers and sisters in Christ from all over the country via Facebook and YouTube. May we all sift what we learned today and bring it to the scriptures, try it on, and walk it through the scriptures and see what holds in the sieve, Father. We are an Acts 17:11 people. We ask your blessing on the message today, and whatever was planted and watered in your name, may you bring a great harvest. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thanks for joining me, folks.